I'm JJ Stankovitz here at the NFL Combine with ESPN draft analyst and fantasy football analyst Field Yates.
Yeah.
Field, big week, obviously, with a lot of news developing about Abdul Carter this week. We got to hear from Tyler Warren today on Thursday. What's maybe been the biggest news item, though, that you've sort of taken away from this week that you wanted to learn that you have now learned about this draft class?
Yeah, I think that probably to this point in the process, because we still have a lot of the on-field question marks to answer, it's the health of Abdul Carter, which the most recent reporting makes me feel as though it's going to be a non-issue relative to where he lands in the draft. But I always say that when we come to Indianapolis, it's the health curveball that can often be amongst the most influential things that you learn about, just because no matter how much you've watched of the player, no matter how much you've heard from teams, I mean, they're not doctors, right? So to have basically head-to-toe evaluation of all these guys and get a better sense of what they're dealing with is an important part of the puzzle. But so far, great week. I mean, it's always a great week. So honored to be here in Indianapolis, and really my favorite host city for this event, and there's no close second.
Well, obviously, we'd love it to stay here. It's where it belongs. It should be here.
Who do I have to talk to?
Yeah, well, I think most people you talk to here would tell you it should stay here, too.
It should, yes.
So you mentioned Abdul Carter.
Yeah.
Colts are not in on Abdul Carter.
Unfortunately,
this is a Colts program. We don't need to talk anymore about a guy who might go number one overall. But your most recent mock draft on ESPN, you had the Colts taking Tyler Warren.
Yeah.
We've heard a lot about Tyler Warren this week, the Penn State tight end. I want to throw it at you. Give me 3 or 4 other guys who you maybe considered to mock to the Colts at 14 other than Tyler Warren, and who are they, what are their fits, and what's their profile?
It's like every year there is a player who's just so obvious that he just gets mocked to that team every single time that it gets boring by the time the NFL draft actually arrives, and then it's like, it'll never happen, right? That seems to be how the NFL draft works. So there were some other guys that were considered there, and with the 14th pick, they're right in that spot where I would argue that this year, like, you start to see a little bit. Like, I think that 20 to 40, like, the prospects available there are fairly comparable. So it's not like, I don't feel like, the guy you're getting at 22 is, like, decidedly better or worse. I mean, better for sure, but, like, you might get the same guy, same level of player at 32. So if I think about the Colts' needs and fits right now, it's going to be a new defense now under Lou. But I think just, some of the defensive reparations there. I am a big proponent in never having enough rushers, even after using your first overall pick on a pass rusher last year. There are some pass rushers who I think will be available at 14 that could be kind of intriguing for the Colts. Even if it is not the most pressing need, I think safety will be a big need for the Colts. We've talked about that, or that has been talked about, I'm sure, plenty over the past month and a half since the season concluded. Malachi Starks has been a guy that has been mocked to the Colts often as well. He is the Georgia safety who had just one interception this past year. It was the first game of the season against Clemson. It was a gorgeous SportsCenter top 10 highlight type of play by him. Had a better year in 2023. Kind of just felt him more, especially in the back end of the defense. But he has a ton of positional versatility. He can hover over the slot and give you some man coverage snaps. He can play in the deep middle portion of the field. He can impact the run defense as well up there in the box. He'd be a name that comes to mind. Nick Emanwori, also at safety from South Carolina, will come to mind as well. Nick might be one of the most impressive players you'll see in terms of just physical stature. He's the proverbial, you want him coming off the bus first kind of guy, 6'3", 227 pounds. That was his roster weight at South Carolina. Could be a little different once we actually measure these guys here in Indianapolis, but he has just tremendous speed. He had a couple of pick sixes this year, but there was one of them which it reminded me of the DK Metcalf chase down of Budda Baker a couple of years ago, where you're just watching it and you're just like, nobody that big is allowed to run that fast, right? And that's what Nick brings to the table in terms of an athletic profile. And maybe this is like too reductive, too simplistic of me, but I will continue to monitor offensive tackles and offensive guards because the NFL has shown us time and again that you got to have those. And the Colts, some questions, middle of the offensive line with Ryan Kelly and his future with the franchise. We'll see where that lands. But Tyler Booker is a tremendous prospect guard who obviously Q is a huge part of what they do and has earned everything he has gotten for the Colts. But you can never have enough good pass protectors. I'm not going to say quarterback because I don't think that there's the right fit there, but, finding ways to empower Anthony and whoever they bring in for competition to me is important.
So you mentioned the quarterback competition there that the Colts are going to have. Chris Ballard told us this week the Colts are going to have an open quarterback competition.
Yeah.
What dominoes need to fall before the Colts can identify that guy who they believe they can bring in to provide that real competition? Because that's something Chris Ballard said is, it's got to be someone who can actually provide competition for Anthony Richardson, and that seems like a tough needle to thread in free agency.
Yeah, because I don't think that player, like I think if you draft a quarterback early, like in the first round, that's not a competition. It's basically holding the place until that quarterback takes the job, right? Like as much as it would hurt to wave the white flag in the fourth pick just 2 years ago, if you're taking a guy 14th overall quarterback, you're doing so because you think he's got the goods to take you to the next level. So I think it would be a quarterback in free agency. But what I don't know is whether there is one that, like, truly, unequivocally, the minute you sign him, comes in and is the guy. There are names and there are options, right? But the best of the bunch is Sam Darnold. I'm following the lead of the top insiders here who have not yet linked him to Indianapolis, right? And that's going to be a significant financial commitment as well. It might be something kind of like where Joe was last year. Maybe not the same money for Joe Flacco, maybe a different age than Joe Flacco as well, but the idea of a guy who's played a lot of football, won a lot of games, and can come in and give you some spark. Wasn't enough last year, obviously, but it was some. But I just hope, and I'm not saying that this hasn't been the case, but I just hope that before that conversation was had publicly, that it was all, and I'm sure it was, but communicated to Anthony very clearly as well, right?
So
that's an important part of it, too.
Chris Ballard did say that Anthony Richardson took the news very well.
Okay.
He's,
I was traveling during this, so I just read the Cliff Notes on the internet.
Yeah, so it sounds like Anthony took the news well. He's, I don't want to say maybe excited about it, but he's, I think, motivated.
You should be, right? Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a really good sign. Where are you at with Anthony Richardson, though, right now?
Man, I was completely intoxicated by him going into last year. He's such an interesting and compelling prospect just because we're talking about not just like unique traits, but like borderline unprecedented physical traits, but the game is so much more than just physical traits. It's, playing quarterback, right? He needs time. I don't think anything that I'm going to say over the next 30 seconds or so is going to blow you away in terms of like never hearing it before. But I do believe that when you take a player who had one season as a college starter, who came out as the youngest quarterback in a draft class, who came out with some questions about ball placement and accuracy, I just think the plan needs to be that we're going to ride this thing out until the bitter end and like sink or swim with this player, because the most important thing that Anthony can get is reps on the field. Now, last year when they made the switch to Joe, I was sort of thinking to myself, you know what, in that division with nobody separated themselves from the pack, like I'm okay with Joe taking over if he can give them a spark and they can start putting points up on the board. When that became clear, it wasn't exactly the answer. I do feel like it was the right call to go back to Anthony, but now I want this to be, we're going to get to the end of the line with Anthony, and that's either some point next year, or it's like a decade and a half from right now, which would be, of course, the ideal scenario.
Where do you feel the Colts are in the AFC South right now? When you think about the division, you think about the team that they have, the opportunity they have to make some move this offseason, where do you think they are?
And we're second. I think that we got a long road ahead here for a couple of teams. Jacksonville and Tennessee made significant changes this offseason for a reason, right? Both hired a new general manager. In the case of Jacksonville, a new head coach as well. So this division is more wide open than the two South divisions are quite wide open. It feels like the Bucs probably deserve. They've got that division. I think understandably they should be viewed as the favorites, but they also had to win games late in the season to cement that spot. So, anyways, the AFC South to me feels wide open enough that the Colts, with a quality offseason and a big step from Anthony, could be division champs as soon as next year. All
right, let's get back to the draft. A question I've been asking some folks here is, how do you view, as someone who analyzes the draft, how do you view NIL, the transfer portal, and conference realignment? Yeah, man, it's such a tricky question because this is as an analyst, not as a fan. Yeah, no, as an analyst, no one cares about how much you have to work, right? But I had draftable grades on 62 players that decided to go back to college this year. Wow. So, and not all the, some of those guys were legitimate, like, maybe top 50 players. A lot of them were more like, hey, I could see this guy getting drafted on day 3. But it really, it requires you to do some extra legwork on guys. And I respect that these players have the right to make the decision to transfer and all that. I have found that in my exposure to some of these players, the moving around to multiple different schools
has resulted in as many experiences that didn't end up being net positives as ones that did result in net positives for the players. So it's very hard to tell a kid who's maybe not playing that much that, you should stick around here where you can get a whole lot more later, because there also have been some great success stories. I mean, SMU and Indiana made the playoff this year, and in part because, as you know, especially with the Hoosiers, like, a lot of that team was brand new this year. It can galvanize a program, but in terms of like what it means for that player's NFL trajectory, not all of these have equated to big quantum leaps forward that have resulted in better NFL prospects.
Something that I've talked with some people about this, though, in terms of evaluation, is with realignment and with the portal, you get more chances to see these guys against top-level competition.
That I'd say is fair, yeah.
And I'm thinking about Layatu Latu, where he's coming out of the Pac-12, which is basically a zombie conference at this point.
Yeah.
But when he was there, he wasn't going up against the kind of caliber of tackles that UCLA players now are going up against in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that maybe means his learning curve into the NFL is a little bit steeper than some of these guys who are coming out of Ohio State and now Oregon, where they are getting these opportunities. How do you think the opportunity to play against more top-level talent in these bigger conferences impacts draft prospects?
Well, there's always this element is that, when you've played in the SEC and you're an offensive tackle, you've seen enough guys every single week that what you see is probably closer to what you're going to get compared to some other conferences. It's just the reality of it. I've watched each of the Georgia-Texas games probably 20 times already this year, right? Not just because, how dramatic these games can be, but also because it feels like the entire roster could end up on NFL fields one day, right? So it definitely helps. And nothing will totally compare or prepare you for the NFL, but the closest thing you're going to get is that high-level competition. The Oregon, Ohio State games, not that the second one was particularly competitive, but that first one in Eugene is a game that I've watched time and again because both teams, especially Ohio State, are loaded with draft prospects this year. So it definitely helps you. And this process will forever be, by nature, unpredictable, but it definitely makes you feel a little more emboldened that your evaluation is closer to where the mark will be in the NFL.
Good stuff. Field Yates, ESPN NFL Draft Day and Fantasy Football Analyst. Appreciate the time, man.
Thanks, JJ. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.